everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar on Housing Landscape 2014, Housing Affordability for Working Households. During this webinar, you will learn about and hear key findings from this year's Housing Landscape Report. My name is Janet Viveris, and I'm a Research Associate at the National Housing Conference and co-author of the Housing Landscape Report. First, I'd like to thank Capital One for sponsoring National Housing Conference webinar series. And thanks also to NeighborWorks America for funding the Housing Landscape 2014 report. However, any opinions or errors expressed in this webinar and in the report are ours alone. Before we begin the webinar, I have a few more introductory notes. First, let's address technical difficulties. While we hope that webinars run smoothly for everyone, we know this doesn't always happen. If you run into any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and the GoToWebinar control panel to send a message to me so that I can try and help resolve the issue. Now, let's cover another frequent question. Is this webinar being recorded? And the answer is yes. We are recording this webinar. An archived copy of the webinar will be available after the webinar is over. We will email a link out to everyone who's registered for the webinar once the recording is online, probably in the next day or so, along with a link to the original report and the PowerPoint slides. So have no fear, you will be able to come back and refer to this in the future. Now, let's move on to the webinar. So today we are talking about Housing Landscape 2014. Housing Landscape is an annual report on housing affordability challenges facing working households. The report uses analysis of the most recent data from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, data on income, housing costs, and housing affordability. The report also focuses on low and moderate income working households, both renters and owners. We use the term working households to describe households where the members work a total of at least 20 hours a week on average and earn no more than 120% of their area median income. Households that are underemployed or unemployed, households that typically have the greatest housing cost burdens, are not captured in our report. And the reason we focus on working households in particular is because it's an often overlooked group of households who work oftentimes multiple jobs and yet still struggle to afford their housing. Now, when we talk about housing affordability, what we're really looking at are what we call severe housing cost burdens. A household is considered to be severely housing cost burdened when it spends at least half of its income on its housing costs. When households are spending such a large share of their income on housing, other parts of their budgets get squeezed. And this often results in households having to cut back on other essentials like food, health care, child care, and transportation. The generally accepted standard of affordability is 30% of household income, to give you some context. So the households we're discussing in this report fell well outside this affordable range. The other thing that you'll see in Housing Landscape 2014 is an analysis of trends since the end of the Great Recession. The official end was 2009, and we examined the trends between 2009 and 2012, which is when the most recent data became available from the American Community Survey. The other thing that you'll find in the Housing Landscape Report is this housing affordability data for all 50 states in the District of Columbia and the 50 largest U.S. metro areas. While a lot of the analysis focuses on national trends and national housing affordability concerns, there is a great deal of variation across the country at the state level and the local level. Housing markets are different in many different parts of the country. So that data helps you to get at where some of these problems are really quite extreme. So before I dive into our findings in the report, I wanted to give you all a chance to tell me what you think that we found. How do you think housing affordability has changed nationwide since 2009 for working households? I'm going to launch a poll that you should see in just a minute pop up on your screen and then give you a minute to actually answer. Okay, so it looks like most of you have had a chance to vote, and it looks like over 80% of you believe that housing affordability has worsened for working households since 2009 at the national level. So now I'm going to show you what we actually found. And we found that actually since 2009, the share of working households with severe housing cost burdens actually fell slightly from 22.8% of working households in 2009 to 22.1% of working households in 2012. Now this is a small decline, but it is a movement in the right direction. So now let's talk about this in a little bit more detail and break it out by working renters and working owners. So in this graph, you see two lines. And the top line, the blue line, represents working renters, and it shows you what share of working renters in 2009, 2010, 2011, and 2012 had severe housing cost burdens. The red line below shows the same for working owners. Now, right off the bat, you can see that working renters are more likely to be severely cost burdened than working owners in all of the years that we looked at since the end of the Great Recession. The other thing that you'll see when you're looking at working renters is that these housing affordability problems really peaked in 2011 with 26.4% of working renters with severe housing cost burdens. And then you see this number reduce slightly between 2011 and 2012. So again, moving in the right direction, a slight improvement. But when you look back to 2009, you see that you actually have a greater share of severely burdened working renters in 2012 than at the end of the recession. So there is still a lot of ground to make up for working renters. 1 in 4 working renter households have a severe housing cost burden in 2012. That's a very high number. Now, when you look below at the working owners, you see there's a slightly better picture. It looks like the housing challenges really peaked for working owners in 2010 and then continued to improve as the share of working owners with severe housing cost burdens decreased to the point in 2012 where a little less than 20% of working owners had this severe housing cost burden. Okay, so let's dig into this a little bit more and find out why housing affordability appears to be improving. So what you can see in this graph in the light blue is the change in median housing costs over 3 years, 2009 to 2012, for working renters and working owners. And then in the dark blue, you see the change in median household income over the course of 3 years. So if you look first at working renters, what you'll see is that household incomes increased at a little over 5% over that 3-year period. Just a little bit more than their housing costs increased, almost 4% between 2009 and 2012. So the improvement in the affordability that we saw on the previous slide for working renters between 2011 and 2012 came because over that 3-year span, you can see that household incomes just slightly outpaced the rise in housing costs. And most of that change, when we broke it apart, really happened between 2011 and 2012. Now, if you move to your right, you'll see a very different picture for working owners. You do see that working owners' income did rise just a little bit by 2% between 2009 and 2012, but you see that their housing costs fell by over 5%. So that improvement that we saw in housing affordability for working owners, unlike working renters, really comes from the decrease in housing costs. So let's think about what's influencing these different housing trends. So what you can see in this chart here is you can see the actual median monthly housing costs for working renters and working owners in all of the years covered in our report. And you can see in every year, rents and utilities that renters paid steadily increase and rose. During the same time, you saw that the housing costs for working owners, so their mortgage payments, their insurance and taxes, steadily decreased. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, as I mentioned, the improvements that we've seen in housing affordability for working renters came as a result of a slight income increase. As we all know, the economic recovery has been very weak, and this income increase really has come on the later end of this time range that we're looking at. And we can't assume that incomes for working renters are going to continue to rise and outpace the rising rents. Everyone should be aware by now that rents are steadily rising, even since we've obtained this latest data. So we can assume that most likely we'll see in next year's report that rents will continue to rise, but we don't know that incomes will keep pace. This really endangers the progress that we saw earlier. For working owners, it's a little bit different, but there are still some concerns. The decreases in the owner costs that we see have come from working owners who have been able to modify their mortgages and reduce their monthly payments, as well as working owners who have been able to refinance their mortgages at lower interest rates, and also actually new working owners who have bought homes at lower prices in housing markets that haven't recovered. Now, what we'll see most likely, and what you've been hearing about in recent years, is that more housing markets are recovering, which in some respects can be a good thing, but it also means that home prices are rising. In some places around the country, rising quite rapidly. So these decreases in housing costs that we've seen for working owners might not be sustainable. So what this all means together is that we can't assume that the economic recovery that we've been seeing is going to make much more headway in reducing these housing affordability problems for both working renters and working owners. Now, let's look at working households with severe housing cost burdens. So what you see in this graph are all of the working households with severe cost burdens broken out by their income level. And you can see that most of these severely cost-burdened working households are either extremely low income or very low income. So these are households who are earning 50% of their area median income or less. One thing to keep in mind as you're looking at that is this is the same group that is targeted by federal housing assistance programs. Now, federal housing assistance programs only reach 1 in 4 households that are actually eligible for assistance. But think about if you didn't have that assistance helping that 1 household out of 4. Think of how much higher these shares would be and these numbers would be. So it's important when we're thinking about how big the housing affordability problem is and what some of the solutions are, that you think about the importance of these existing housing assistance programs. Now, what you see on this slide is a map of the United States, and in each state you see the share of working households with a severe housing cost burden in each state. And the colors correspond to these rates. So the darkest red is in the states with the highest share of severely cost-burdened households. And the lightest red, that light pink, is in the states with the lowest share of severely cost-burdened working households. And unsurprisingly, you can see that in some traditionally high-cost housing markets, like in California, Florida, New Jersey, you have at least 30% of the working households in these states who are spending at least half of their income on their housing. And as you move into the center of the country, you still see many states where these rates are still very high. In fact, in 21 states, at least 1 in 5 working households has a severe housing cost burden. We didn't map the 50 largest metro areas that we looked at in the report, but what we did find is similar to what we found among the states. We found among the states between 2009 and 2012 that there were housing affordability improvements in 13 states. And these were mostly clustered in the Midwest and West, where for-sale markets haven't fully yet recovered and owner costs were still declining. There was only one state where we found an increase in the share of working households with a severe housing cost burden, and that was New York State. Now, as I mentioned, we didn't map the metro areas, but we saw some similar trends. Of the 50 largest U.S. metros, most had stable or slightly improved housing affordability between 2009 and 2012. But we actually had 3 metro areas where the share of working households with severe burdens increased. The first was New York City, which has had a well-publicized affordable housing crisis that it's grappling with now. The second was Virginia Beach, Virginia, and when we looked into it, we found that during that time we're looking at there was actually a decrease in median household incomes in that area, which most likely contributed to housing affordability challenges. And the third was Louisville, Kentucky. And when we looked into that case, we really didn't have any leads as to why housing affordability might have gotten worse there. Now I'm going to switch over for a moment to our report, which I will send a link to after the webinar. And I'm going to show you the appendices. So in Appendix A, what you see is a list of all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And we've provided housing affordability data for each state. You'll see in that first light blue column, we show you the total number of working households in 2012. And then next to that, the total number of working households with a severe housing cost burden. We translated that also into the share of working households with severe housing cost burdens, like we show on the map for 2012. But to give you some reference, we also showed what that share was in 2009. As you can see in many of these cases, that share is different in 2012 than 2009. But what we did is in the furthest right-hand column, we actually starred the states where we found that that difference in share was statistically significant. In the other cases, we found different shares, but due to margins of error, it wasn't entirely clear whether the change fell in the margin of error, and we couldn't be confident that there was an actual difference. So one thing that's important, if you're using Housing Landscape to really document a problem in your state, oftentimes providing shares and percentages can help give people a number they can wrap their head around, but I find that it's also important sometimes just to share the actual number because it can be a bit staggering. For example, in California, even though as you look to the right, you'll see that there was a slight decline in the number and share of working households with severe cost burdens in that state, you see that over 1.5 million households, working households in California, had a severe housing cost burden in 2012. That is a large number of working households, despite the fact that there is an improvement. So there's still a huge problem in many of these states. Now I'm going to scroll down to the second appendix, Appendix B, where you see the same data, but this time for the 50 largest metropolitan statistical areas. And as I mentioned before, in the furthest right-hand column, you'll see stars next to the metro areas where we've determined that there's been a statistically significant difference in the share of working households with severe cost burdens. Now, what you can do, too, is using these lists, you can get an idea of how your metro area stacks up against those in your region to get a sense of how problems vary within your region, or to document that the problem is region-wide and get at maybe some regional solutions. So let's go back to the webinar. And let's talk about what this all means. So as we've talked about, even though Housing Landscape 2014 shows some slight improvements in housing affordability nationwide and for renters and owners separately, even though we've seen improvements in a handful of states and metro areas, there are still many low and moderate income working households who face severe housing cost burdens. What this means is, even as we're seeing improvements for working owners in terms of housing affordability, there's still some negative ramifications that they're dealing with because of the housing crash. So even though working owners might be spending less of their income on housing, we're finding that fewer working renters can transition to homeownership. That securing credit and mortgages to buy a home has become a real challenge as lending standards have become stricter. This barrier to homeownership then becomes a barrier to wealth creation, which has some long-term impacts for low and moderate income households. Next, when you're thinking about the impact of a severe cost burden on budgets, think about what it means for the local economy. So when a household is spending more than half their income on their housing, they're not spending that money elsewhere. They're not spending it on other goods and services that they need. And these are goods and services that could help economic growth in their region and help the economic recovery. And finally, the reason to actually do something about housing affordability is because affordable and stable housing is a key platform for important positive family and community outcomes. Households that live in affordable housing have better physical and mental health. They also find that children in affordable homes have better educational achievement. And also, affordable housing leads to robust economic development. These are all positive things that we want in our community and we want across the nation. And this is why it's important to tackle housing affordability across the board. At this point, I would like to open it up to questions. So feel free to use the GoToWebinar control panel, and you can submit your question in the question section. And while you're submitting them, I also want to take this moment to reiterate for those who might have entered the webinar after we began that we are recording this webinar, and we will be emailing a link of the recording as well as the PowerPoint slides and the actual housing landscape report to everyone who's registered for the webinar in the next few days. Okay, so let's get to your questions. And the first one comes from Rachel, and she was asking about what housing assistance programs I was referring to earlier when I mentioned that federal housing assistance programs only reach 1 in 4 eligible households. So what I was referring to were the Housing Choice Voucher Program and public housing. So we know that of the eligible households that would qualify for this assistance, only 1 in 4 is receiving it. And what you can see also is when you go to the individual public housing authority websites, and public housing authorities are the entities that administer both public housing and housing choice voucher programs in their area, you find that across the country, many of these housing authorities have had to close their wait lists because the demand for assistance is so high that wait lists extend not just years, but for example here in DC where I'm located, extend decades. So that's something that's very real, and certainly sequestration didn't help matters at the time. We have another question from Courtney, and Courtney asks whether we will have state and county level data available. So Courtney, as I showed in the map of the U.S., we do have state level data available, and that'll also be listed in the appendix of the report where it's a little bit easier to get at. We don't use county level analysis. So we do use the metro area level, which oftentimes includes several counties. But what you can do if you want to get county level data on housing affordability and housing need, you can use the Census Bureau's American Fact Finder tool. And the director of the Center for Housing Policy here at the National Housing Conference, Lisa Sturdivant actually just did a PowerPoint last week, which went through how you can use American Fact Finder to actually locate that data. So what I can do, Courtney, is if you want to email me, my email's up on the slide, I can send you a link to that webinar if you want to go through how to obtain that data. Rachel asked if participants will receive a copy of today's PowerPoint. Yes, you will. Have no fear. I will send a link to the recording, the PowerPoint, and the report so you can look at it all together. Joanne submitted a question, and it says, how does this data impact seniors? So while we don't specifically segment seniors in our analysis for the report, we know that they make up a large share of these low and moderate income working households. They fall outside this working household definition that we talk about, but they do fall into a segment of households that we know are severely impacted by housing affordability challenges. Seniors in particular often show up once they've stopped working in the group of unemployed or underemployed. And we know from our analysis that that group is the most impacted by housing cost challenges. Particularly for seniors who rent, it's a real challenge for them to afford rising rents on fixed incomes. Many older adults rely on Social Security payments or pension payments, and so they're really struggling to keep up as rents continue to rise. Now, working seniors who haven't yet left the workforce might also be captured in this working household population that we're looking at. That's certainly a reality for many seniors, is that they must work later and later into life to continue to support themselves. Okay, so we have a question from Carlos. Does the report let you dig into local data? For example, can I see the differences between city and neighborhoods analysis, for example, in Portland, Oregon? That's a great question, Carlos, and unfortunately in the report we don't dig into the neighborhood level. What you can do, as I mentioned just a little bit earlier, is you can get some neighborhood data on housing affordability from the Census Bureau's American Fact Finder tool. And as I mentioned earlier, Lisa Sturdivant had a great webinar that walks you through that process of finding that neighborhood level data. Oftentimes it's presented by Census Track. And she goes through that and explains how you can find out what neighborhoods are located in which census tracts. So Carlos, if you want to go ahead and email me directly, I can send you a link to that webinar. Okay, so we have a question from Matthew. Is there any correlation between states with high foreclosure rates and subsequent burden on renters? That is an excellent question, Matthew. We haven't done any real statistical analysis to determine what kind of correlation and what level of correlation there is, but we know anecdotally that one of the reasons for the rising rents across the country is the high demand for rental units, and that's been fed for years by foreclosed households who are transitioning out of ownership into renting. It also means that is combined with the renter households that would like to buy but have been really blocked from obtaining credit and mortgages. So we haven't done any statistical correlating between high foreclosure rates and burdens on renters, but we know that it's certainly a reality, particularly in states like Florida, where you see very high levels of burden, but you also see very high foreclosure rates in many areas. So they're definitely linked. Joanne has another question. Why isn't there more help with housing if it's in such high demand? That's a great question. I think what a lot of housing advocates are finding is in an era of very constrained public resources, housing is just one of the things that's fighting for attention. There is great housing need, but there are also other social needs, and it's challenging to convince policymakers that investment in affordable housing pays dividends in other areas. For example, like I mentioned, investing in housing can lead to better health outcomes, which in turn, down the line, will reduce health spending. Better investment in affordable housing can lead to greater educational achievement among children, which can lead to declines in some of the educational interventions. But these are long-term dividends, and it's very difficult to take money from different programs and to convince people that housing really is an investment not just in a roof, but in a healthier community. Okay, Carlos asked if the presentation was recorded. Yes, the presentation is being recorded, and I will be sure to send everyone a link to the recording. We have a question from Shannon. Shannon asked, could the decline in severe cost burden owners be attributed at all to individuals who lost their homes during the foreclosure crisis and had to become renters? So that's a great question. That's one of the reasons that we're looking at the share in addition to the number of working owners who have severe burdens. So in each year we're looking at how many working owners are there, and of those, what share is severely cost burdened. So as we saw these working owners who may have lost their home to foreclosure or moved out to preempt a foreclosure and become renters, that's shrinking that population that we're looking at. So it shouldn't affect the share as much and as directly, but what it does leave is potentially the working owners who are in better financial footing. So there certainly could be an impact, but it's difficult to quantify. The next question is a great one from Shannon. Are you using 1-year, 3-year, or 5-year ACS estimates data? So for all of you that have played around with the American Community Survey, this is a very important question. So Shannon, we used 1-year data for each year. So for example, we used the 1-year data file for 2009, the 1-year data file for 2010, 2011, 2012, and then compared those. We have a question from Terry. Aren't housing co-ops a good solution? Housing co-ops are certainly a great idea and a great solution. One thing to think about when you're thinking about housing affordability and what to do to improve it, what you find is there's rarely one answer. So it's certainly not just that we need to preserve federal housing assistance programs, but we need a wide array of housing solutions in every area. So it's a combination of housing assistance programs and other housing models, such as housing co-ops, that really can do a great job of addressing housing needs at a variety of different levels. For example, not all households want to be homeowners. So we need to make sure that we have rental housing solutions and that we also have ownership solutions for those households that do want to be owners or that already are owners. We have another question from Courtney. Courtney asks, I wondered if mortgage modifications contributed to slightly decreased cost burden. I know you have not looked at foreclosure data, but it would be interesting to know. Again, we didn't dive into this in detail, so we don't know how many of these working owners that we looked at were able to complete mortgage modifications. But we do know that the sum total of homeowners who were able to pursue mortgage modifications and refinancing at lower interest rates and new homeowners buying at lower costs all contributed to this declining amount. It's definitely a great question to see if in another project we can dive in further and see if we can isolate where some of these decreasing costs are coming from, particularly as we're thinking about housing markets rebounding across the country. We don't anticipate seeing these large decreases continue. We have another question from Terry. Many people are doubling up. Do you have data on that? That is a great point, and that is actually not something that we looked at in this report. Another source, I'm going to keep plugging it, to find data on how many people are doubling up and where this is the biggest issue is the Census Bureau's American Fact Finder. We know anecdotally that the way many people are handling rising rent costs and for the working owners who are facing rising owner costs is to double up. In fact, the height of the foreclosure, and I'm sure it continues in many metro areas to this day, as households are being foreclosed on, oftentimes they actually don't end up renting on their own, but they might double up with other family or friends that own a home or might have an existing rental unit. We have a question from Sarah Schwartz. Were you able to see any impact on vet populations? Would it be possible to be tied to SSVF or other VA preventative programs? So we didn't segment out vet populations in this report, but it's a great question. We know that the veteran population is struggling in many regards with housing affordability challenges. And there are a lot of great programs offered by the VA to try and help veteran homeowners avert foreclosure or issue veterans housing vouchers to avert and prevent homelessness. So it's not something we've examined in this report. However, the National Housing Conference did recently release a report on some great supportive service programs that serve veteran households. And we're going to be doing some more work on veteran populations going forward in this year. We have a question that is, do you have recommendations or best practices that are proven strategies to combat rising costs of housing prices? You mentioned some already, but wondered if you had a more detailed list or report that you've done at some point with more detail. That is an excellent question. We actually have a whole website devoted to this. So it's even more than a list, but in some regards it's a whole housing guide and housing tutorial. And this website is called housingpolicy.org. And what it does is it offers a variety of different housing solutions based on best practices and research. And it also goes into what kinds of contexts these solutions work in best. For example, a lot of work being done here at the center right now is focused on inclusionary housing policies, which focus on giving housing developers incentives or mandates to include affordable units in new developments. And this can be a more effective tool in places where land values are very high, and it can be financially difficult to build affordable housing, and the high land prices can help support some of these affordable units mixed into a larger development. So that's just one example, but the housingpolicy.org website is a great place to peruse. It takes a lot of these different looks that you've all suggested. For example, looking at solutions geared specifically towards older adults. There's a section focused on housing and transportation because we know that investments in transportation can also lead to rising housing prices in the area. So I definitely recommend you all take a look at housingpolicy.org for great ideas on housing solutions. Next, we have a question that is, do you think the focus on working households paints a different picture than if you look at all households would? I'm wondering if the continued high unemployment numbers would result in increasing housing cost burdens across all households, or if it wouldn't make much of a difference. That's a great question, Laura. We have thought about looking at all households. We did actually in the beginning of the report provide just the overall nationwide statistic on how many households in the U.S. across the board were severely cost burdened. And in 2012, this was 15.6%. So that's actually lower than the share we found with the working households, which I mentioned before is in 2012 was just about 22%. So while I do think you would get some very different results when you look at all households, you would factor in these unemployed and underemployed households and see the areas of the country where unemployment is having a real impact on housing affordability, but it can also get obscured by higher income households who are not struggling with their housing costs. One thing to consider that comes from your question is just looking across the board at all low and moderate income households. And that way we would be getting households that don't fall well above what is normal in the area, but getting the households, both unemployed and employed, who would be making less than 120% of the area median income. So that's a great recommendation. We have another question. Do you think that Section 8 rent payments will gain national momentum into paying for mortgages? So I'm not quite clear on what you're getting at, Mariana. Section 8 rent payments are for rental units, and that's part of the Housing Choice Voucher program, where eligible households pay 30% of their income towards their rent, and then the assistance makes up the difference between 30% of their income and the actual rent cost for their unit. We do know that it is a struggle to provide enough vouchers, housing choice vouchers, to eligible households, but it's a very important way to make sure that these households earning less than 50% of the area median income aren't spending more than 30% of their income on their housing, since that's what is really considered to be affordable. So it looks like the questions have trailed off, but if you have any additional questions or ideas that you want to discuss with me, please email me. My email address is up on the slide. I'm also happy to take your phone call. And just one last time, in case anyone's missed it, we have recorded this webinar. And once we get it up online, we will send a follow-up email to all of you that have attended. But if you have any friends who signed up and couldn't attend, we will be sure to send the link to the recording, to the PowerPoint slides, and to the actual report as well. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. I'd also like to thank Capital One again for its financial support for NHC's webinar series, and for NeighborWorks America for its support of the Housing Landscape 2014 report. To learn more about events that are hosted by the Center for Housing Policy and National Housing Conference, as well as webinars that range in topic, please visit www.nhc.org to find out what we have going on, as well as find out how you can connect to us on Twitter and Facebook and keep up with all of the great work we're doing. Thanks again for joining us.